speaking to you today from Matthew 24, a discourse of Jesus that is commonly called the Olivet Discourse. The context is he has just left the temple in Jerusalem. He has said, he's pronounced judgment on the scribes and Pharisees and the leaders of Israel, the leaders of the Jews, who by and large rejected him. He pronounced judgment upon them at the end of chapter 23. The disciples come to him at the beginning of 24 and said, look at the beautiful buildings of the temple. The meaning is, Jesus, maybe you're a little too hasty in pronouncing this severe judgment. Don't you see how beautiful the temple is? How can you say he left the temple, Jesus did, and he said, your house is left to you desolate? Now that is a pretty severe thing to say. He doesn't even say the temple of God. He says your house. It's as though God has abandoned the temple and he's turned it over to them. It's all right, have it your way. I'm leaving, it's your house now. And he says, your house is left to you desolate. Jesus turns to them and says, in chapter 24, verse 2, do you not see all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Being concerned, as naturally they should be, the disciples turned to Jesus and they said privately, when shall these things be? Now, Jesus, they've asked a direct question. When shall these things be? And they add on, the things they mean are when the temple is destroyed and every stone is thrown down. We know, looking back, that it occurred in 70 A.D. But they said, tell us when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Or literally the end of the age. Not our age, but their age. The age in which the temple was a part. The age in which the Mosaic law and the Mosaic sacrifices were a part. The age in which they were living, the age of the law of Moses, in which an animal sacrifices and a Jewish temple, which would be culminated and concluded and brought to a termination by the destruction of that temple. So then he begins to give them a long series of descriptions to encourage them and to warn them, to prepare them for what they would see. He said, you will see all these things come to pass. See that you be not troubled. You will hear of wars. You will hear of rumors of wars. When he said that, let me just say again, he didn't mean us. He meant them. If he had meant us, he would have said, some people later need to hear this, so write it down for them. He didn't. He said, you will see all these things. In verse 15, we left off in the previous message talking about this. Verse 15, he said to them, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. Whoso readeth, let him understand. And then let him that be in Judea flee to the mountains. Now when he said, when you shall see the abomination of desolation, another translation might be, the abominable thing that makes desolate. Do you remember something I just quoted to you at the end of chapter 23? When he left the temple, he says, your house is left to you desolate. And he says, when you see the abomination that makes desolate stand in the holy place, that is your cue to get out of town. That is your cue to flee from Judea unto the mountains. Now let me read you a parallel passage. This is from Luke's Gospel. This is the same passage in Luke's Gospel, but it's said in a little different words, and now you can understand what it's talking about. We don't even have to turn back to Daniel. We don't even have to talk about Jewish history. Just look at what Luke's Gospel says in Luke chapter 21, a parallel passage. And when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter therein too. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things that are written may be fulfilled. Now notice in Matthew's Gospel, he said, when you see the abomination of desolation, flee to the mountains. In Luke's Gospel, he says, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, know that the desolation is near. Then let those that are in Judea flee to the mountains. So the cue to flee to the mountains was when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies. Or to say it another way, the armies of Rome, which would come and make the temple desolate, when you see them standing in Jerusalem, in the holy places, formerly holy places, when you see the armies of Rome coming on the scene, that's your cue to get out of town. Don't wait any longer. You see, we don't even have to talk about the abomination of desolation in Daniel, and that's an interesting study, and the historical fulfillments and predecessors of that. But the bottom line is, he says, when you see armies surrounding Jerusalem, it's time to get up and go, because it's going to be destroyed. You know, you should ask yourself, why did Jesus bother to say these words? He is saying them for the benefit of his 12 disciples that he loved. Peter and James and John. He did not want them to be destroyed with the unbelieving Jews who rejected him. He wanted them to be saved. He wanted their lives to be saved. He said, he that endures to the end shall be saved. And he says to them, not to us, not to any other generation other than the one then living. He says, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, when you see the abomination that's going to make desolate, get up and get out of town. Now Josephus, who wrote a history of the Jewish rebellion and the Roman suppression of that rebellion and the Jewish war, described a curious event in which a Roman general, which had besieged Jerusalem, inexplicably, for some reason unknown to anyone but himself, pulled the armies back to a great distance, and people had an opportunity to leave the city. And do you know that the only people who left were a group of Christians who remembered the prophecy of Jesus and who left Jerusalem, and they fled out into the mountains and they were saved. You know, Josephus records this exact fulfillment in his annals and histories of the Jewish rebellion. Okay, you know what's interesting? How could anyone read this and apply it to our modern day? It's beyond what I can comprehend. I cannot understand how you misread a passage like this that is so clearly tied and given to the people that are in Jesus' day, His own disciples, and which is clearly fulfilled in history. But I'll tell you, though, on the other hand, I know why. It's because we don't understand how to read spiritual language. As this Olivet Discourse begins to continue, Jesus begins to use prophetic language, spiritual language. Prophetic language and spiritual language is language which uses pictures and symbols and figures. When we come to the book of Revelation, we're going to see that completely from start to finish. Everything is symbolic. Everything is in a figure. If you go back to the Old Testament and read about the prophets, read the words of the prophets, Isaiah and Ezekiel especially, and Jeremiah and others of the prophets, they use spiritual language which is symbolic, which is figurative. Jesus, as a great prophet himself, begins to adopt that same language. He doesn't mean it to be taken literally in a literal sense. He means it to be symbolic. Now let's go on reading. I want to point out a few other things. He says, pray that your flight, verse 20, be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath day, speaking to them. It's interesting that he points out the Sabbath day because, you know what? They were living under the law. The law meant something to them. In our day, we don't observe the Jewish Sabbath. So it's specifically referring to that generation of Jewish believers who believed in Jesus but were also living under the law. They're going to see all of that come to an end. Verse 21, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. You know, the great tribulation he's talking about is not something in our future. You know, this is almost universally believed that there's some 7-year period of time coming in the future in which some political leader called an Antichrist is going to rise up and rule the world, and that's called the Great Tribulation. Listen, I only say to people who say that, show it to me in the Bible. Show me in the Bible where there's any 7-year tribulation. You can't find it anywhere. There's no 7-year tribulation in the Bible. Where we get this language of Great Tribulation, it's clearly, if you read it in the context, it's clearly tied to the people living in his generation. And if you read Josephus, you find out that there really was Great Tribulation. And he says, it has not been since the beginning, and no, it will never be again. Now that ought to be a relief to you, because you might go through some trouble in your life, but you're never going to go through, and in our future, we will never go through what they went through in this great tribulation. Verse 22, and except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Now who are the elect? Well, he's talking about a judgment upon Jerusalem in which the Jerusalem temple is going to be thrown down. If you read Paul's writings in Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11, which are specifically about Israel and why didn't Israel believe and why didn't they accept Jesus, he said they were all in unbelief except for a small group, a remnant called the elect. Paul calls them the elect or a remnant. It just means a small group who did believe, meaning these disciples and others like them. He says, verse 24, there shall arise false Christs, false prophets, and they shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they should deceive the very elect. But it's not possible, and they didn't deceive the very elect. The elect that he's talking about are not people in our day, but people, the 12 disciples and others who believed. Let's just say those 120 who were in the upper room, and others like them, who believed in Jesus, who lived to see these things, and they lived through it just as he predicted they would. And they took him seriously, and they left Jerusalem and were preserved while Jerusalem was destroyed.